How are you doing? Today, I'd like to look at ways in which we can guard our, what do you think I'm going to say there? The picture seems to depict our heart and our mind, doesn't it? Guard your heart and your mind. That's the biblical instruction or guideline, whatever you want to say. But let's put a more modern, more contemporary spin on it, because the terminology that we're hearing nowadays is guard your mental health. How's your mental health? Now, on the NHS website, there's a really good check, a little test that you can do. Go online and you can evaluate how you are doing emotionally. Some of you are saying right now, I don't need a test to tell me how I'm doing emotionally. But there's 18 questions, and they go through some really, I think it's really good. Things like, have you been sleeping? How do you feel when you get up in the morning? What are your eating habits like? Are you overeating? Are you not eating enough? Are you fidgeting? Are you too sort of do you find yourself behaving kind of in a slothful way, or are you just speeded up and irritated? Do you find yourself flying off the handle more regularly than usual? What is your mental health like? And I'd encourage you to go through this test on the NHS website. 18 questions, fairly straightforward. You can go through them yourself. I'm not going to go through each one of them now. Not only is the NHS very concerned about mental health, but also the World Health Organization. They say that depression affects 264 million people across the globe. That's a huge amount of people. And so if you've been feeling down, well, let me tell you this, you are not alone. Not only that, but the World Health Organization say that, the global economy loses $1 trillion US per year in productivity due to depression and anxiety related issues. That's a lot. This is a real issue. And the NHS gives some really good advice. And if you are struggling with this, I encourage you, log onto their website and read up on this. It really is helpful. They say here's 5 steps to mental well-being. Connect with other people. Number 2, be physically active. Learn new skills. Give to others. Pay attention to the present. In other words, what's happening right now. That's such a key element, because we can get ourselves so sucked into worrying about the future. What's going to happen tomorrow? How long is this pandemic going to last? Are we going to be locked down again? What is going to happen? Rather focus on what's going on right now. But here's a question. Does the Bible have anything to say about how to guard our heart and our mind? Well, yes, it certainly does. And the incredible thing is that you and I are we are made up. We are social beings. We are mental beings, but we are also spiritual beings. And so it's great to look at this helpful, really good advice, which will help us mentally and emotionally, socially. But please don't neglect the spiritual aspect as well. A tripod cannot stand too well on just 2 of its legs. You need all 3 legs to be able to be well balanced. And so I'd like us to look at a number of characters this morning, but mainly at David, King David. He had a seriously rough time. If anyone had an excuse. Does one need an excuse? This is actually just something which seems to overtake us. It overwhelms us. But if there was a Bible character who had every reason to battle with mental health, it would have been David. You know, he was rejected by his father-in-law, who, just by the way, happened to be the king at that time, and he was kicked out of his home. We read here in 1 Samuel, it says, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and how much his daughter Michal loved him, Saul became even more afraid of him, and he remained David's enemy for the rest of his life. Every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than any of the rest of Saul's officers. So David's name became very famous, and that began to bug Saul. So what does Saul do? He urges his servants and even his son Jonathan to assassinate David. And so David goes on the run. And then it says, David kept thinking to himself, someday Saul is going to get me. You know what? The best thing I can do is escape to the Philistines. And then Saul will stop hunting for me in Israelite territory. Saul will never think that I've gone to hide out amongst the Philistines, our enemy. And so David concocts this plan, and he goes along to King Ashish, the son of Maok. These incredibly difficult to pronounce names. I'm sorry about that. But David and these families that had gathered around him, they settle in Philistine country. And then a day came along where David said to the Philistine king, you know, if it's okay with you, we would rather live in one of the country towns, because he was living in the king's city. And so the king gives him this town, Ziklag. And David and his men lived there for over a year and 4 months to be precise. That's what the Bible tells us. And so the time came when the Philistine kings got together and they were going to war. And so David gathers his men, his army. He had an army of 600 men. And so he gathers his men and he marches out with the Philistine king, King Ashish, and the other Philistine rulers. They look at King Ashish and they say, what are these Jews doing here? They can't come to war with us. So they didn't have that relationship with David as King Ashish had. And so they send David back. And so David goes back to Ziklag, and they'd already marched out for 3 days. So it takes them 3 days to get back to Ziklag. But when they get back to their home, they discover that the Amalekites had raided their town while all the men were away. They'd burnt the place down. They had stolen all the livestock, everything, including the women and children. Now, we're talking about guarding your mental health. Imagine how David and his men felt right there. I mean, let's just recap. David has been kicked out of his own home by the king of his own people. David is not yet the king. Saul was. Saul kicks him out, and Saul actually is trying to kill him. So he's been rejected by his own people. He goes to live with the Philistines. Now he's been rejected by the Philistines. He goes back to what he has now made his home, and his home is burnt down. How would you feel? This is like, lockdown upon lockdown upon lockdown and worse. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 3 to 4, just to give you an understanding. It says, when David and his men saw the ruins and they realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. They wept until they could weep no more. How was his mental health? Do you perhaps think that we could look and learn from David by seeing what he did next? David, what did you do? Because if you found a way of coping with this situation, then surely I can cope with what I'm going through right now. Here's what David did. If that wasn't bad enough, it gets worse. David was now in great danger because his own men, his own army, were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning David. So his own army now want to kill him. And then it says this, but David found strength in the Lord his God. David found strength in the Lord his God. That is how he guarded his heart and his mind. That is how he guarded his mental health. And then what David does. So I don't know quite exactly what he did in order to take strength from God. Perhaps he sat down, he was meditating, he prayed, he certainly prayed, and he realigned his value system and his priorities. And he, if you read through some of David's songs, which we have in the Bible in the book of Psalms, he writes things like, "Why so downcast, O my soul?" And these songs start off down, but then he says, "Yet I will put my hope in God." It's like he picks himself up and he says, "God's on my side. I'm going to do this." And so David and his 600 men, they set out to go and find these Amalekites and to get their women and children back. And then they come to this mighty river Besor. Oh, sorry, I read that incorrectly. It says the brook Besor. What comes to mind if you hear the words river or if you hear the words brook? Surely a brook is something narrow. It's small. It's not flowing like in flood. It's a brook. But you know what? Some of David's men were so emotionally and physically drained. I mean, just they'd marched out for 3 days. Then they were turned around. They had to turn around and come back. They were rejected by their sort of host nation. So they now come back another 3 days, and then they discover their town is in ruins and their wives and children have been taken captive. In fact, they don't even know if they're alive. They then march out to go and find them, and they get to this brook and they sit there and they say, "We can't anymore. We just can't. We can't go any further." And so 200 of the men, a third of David's army, that's quite significant. They say, "We just can't." And they collapse at this brook, Besor. And so David continues with 400 of his soldiers. And then as they're going along, they find an Egyptian in a field. And you know what strikes me here is, just take note of what David does. His men bring him to David, and they give him some bread to eat and water to drink. I mean, this is not a Jew. He's not a Philistine. He's an Egyptian. So he's more than likely a slave. But David takes pity on everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a king of a nation or if you're a slave. David took pity on him. They also gave him part of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins. Now, these were men who set out to battle. They've been marching for more than 6 days. They get to their own town everything. There's no supplies. Where did they get this food to give to this Egyptian? This must have been the last of their food. They couldn't have had too much supplies left, but they give it to this Egyptian. For he hadn't had anything to eat or drink for 3 days and nights. And before long, his strength returned. And then David asks him, to who do you belong? And where do you come from? Just, you can pick up the tone in David's voice just by reading these words. David is being kind to this Egyptian. I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite, he replied. Now, David was enemies with the Amalekites. So here is a slave of one of his enemies. Let's see what happens next. The slave says his master abandoned him 3 days ago because he was sick. Now, not sure how you feel, but back in the day, that would have been considered, I think, normal practice. Your slave becomes a burden to you, so just leave him to die. He's your slave. Did you notice David did not do that? Because here was this Egyptian sicker than he would have been when he was with his master. But instead, David takes him in and gives him food. And he's kind to him. But this Egyptian slave goes on to say, we were on our way back from raiding the Kerethites in the Negev, the territory of Judah, and the land of Caleb. So now, hey, this guy was part of a raiding party that took on the Israelites. That's my people. And we had just burnt Ziklag. Wow. Question, what would you do right there? This man has just said he was one of those responsible for burning down your town. David says to him, will you lead me to this band of raiders? I'm quite surprised there that David didn't kill him on the spot. So this Egyptian slave leads them. They find the Amalekites spread out across the fields, eating and drinking, dancing with joy because of the vast amount of plunder they'd taken from the Philistines and the land of Judah. David and his men, now listen to this, David and his men rushed in among them and slaughtered them throughout that night and the entire next day until evening. None of the Amalekites escaped, except 400 young men who fled. How big was David's army? 400. 400 of the Amalekites ran away. With 400 men, the amount that managed to escape, with 400 men, David slaughtered the Amalekite army. How big was that army? It took them the entire night and the next day until evening. That's a lot of fighting. That's a lot of killing. These men were tired. So they wipe out the Amalekites. They get their women and children back. They get their livestock, and they now get all of the spoils of that the Amalekites had taken from their previous raids. And so David returns to the brook Besor, and he meets up with the 200 men that were too tired to even cross the brook. They go out to meet David and his men, and David greets them joyfully. Just take note of David's attitude here. David greets them joyfully. But some evil troublemakers among David's men said, they didn't go with us, so they can't have any of the plunder that we recovered. Give them their wives, but no spoils. And you know what David says? No, brothers. Don't be selfish with what the Lord has given us. Aren't you blown away by David's response? Can you begin to see this kind, loving, considerate man of God? Where was David's focus? See, David, his top focus was God. You know, when things went wrong, who did he turn to? Well, we've just read that he strengthened himself in the Lord. But then even when he was so tired, his focus was still on helping others. You know, if it's an Egyptian slave, or if it's one of my own men who is too tired to even go to war, I'm going to greet them with a smile. I'm going to treat them with dignity because I consider them as better than myself. Can you begin to see how David was guarding his mental health? And then, you know, his kindness goes on. It says, when he arrived at Ziklag, David sent part of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends. He doesn't just keep all the wealth for himself, but now he blesses his friends. He says, here's a present for you. Taken from the Lord's enemies, he said. The gifts were sent to the people of the following towns that David had visited. So all the friends that he's made, he just sends them his money. He sends them all the spoils of battle. So how did David guard his mental health? Great question. He did it by keeping his priorities in order. Or should I say, keeping his priorities in check. What were his priorities? Again, great question. God first, others second, and then himself last. Through that story, you might want to read through that story again in 1 Samuel and just take note of David's priorities. He put God first, others second, and he thought of his own needs last. Wow. Let's look now at a story from the New Testament. And this is about Jesus. And Jesus' cousin, who he was close to. His cousin's name was John. You would have heard of him, John the Baptist. He had been taken prisoner, and it's a really tragic story, but he was executed, and his head was cut off, and John's disciples hear about it, and they go and they take his body to bury it, and they now go and they tell Jesus what happened. How would you feel if one of your close family members was unjustly executed and you've just heard about it? You've just heard about it. How did Jesus respond in this situation? It says, as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to go to a remote area to be alone. You know, just think of the emotions here. Jesus doesn't hear the news and go for a walk. He wants to be completely alone. He gets on a boat and he goes out into the sea. He gets on a boat and he goes to a remote area with the specific intention of being alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and they followed on foot from many towns. So Jesus gets off the boat. It says this, he saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat. And he was so drained emotionally and he just wanted to be on his own that he chased them all away. That might be what you or I would have done, but it's not what Jesus did. It says, as he saw the huge crowd, he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Now come on. Send the people away. And Jesus still is thinking about the others. And so he says, no, feed them. See, Jesus had the same priorities as David. It's God first, others second, and then thinking about his own needs. Paul the Apostle, he kind of cemented this when he wrote to the church at Philippi. He said, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing. And then he goes on to say that Jesus took on the nature of a servant and became obedient to death, and not just normal death, but death on a cross. The point here is, have the same mindset that Christ had. Think of others before you think of yourself. So, how can we guard our mental health? How can we have joy in a really terrible situation? What does the Bible say? We know what people who have studied the mind and the emotions, we know what they would say. They'd say, connect with other people, exercise, watch your diet, make sure that you remaining fit and focused, have a purpose to live for. But there's a spiritual element as well, which is going to help you to guard your mental health. Something that'll give you joy. And joy is not just, it's not laughing in the face of horrific circumstances. That's not joy. Joy is something deep down. Joy is something that comes from within. Joy, and this is so simple, but yet it's profound. Joy comes when we put Jesus first, others second, and ourselves last. That's how we find joy. That is how we guard our mental health. Here's another very, very simple statement. What you focus on is what you will see. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? What you focus on is what you will see. In other words, if I am focusing on my problem, I'm not going to have any hope, because all I'm going to see is my problem. If I look at the tiny little thing that's gone wrong in my life, I will not see all the good things. And so you see, by having this formula for joy, we're forcing ourselves to take the focus off ourselves. Look to Jesus. Look at others. And that's the formula for guarding your mental health. To put Jesus first. Always keep focused on God. Make your spiritual walk with Jesus a top priority. When things go wrong, be like David, strengthen yourself in the Lord. And then, when you've got strength again, look to see how you can help someone else. Because what happens is that as you and I look at other people's problems and we try to help them, we begin to realize, wow, I'm not actually in such a bad situation. And we spend our time helping them, and all of a sudden we don't realize that we are feeling down, because we're no longer feeling down. It brings incredible joy to be able to help someone else and to see the smile on their face and to hear them say, thank you. Look to meet the needs of other people before you seek to have your own needs met. That is how you and I can guard our mental health. And so I pray that each one of us, and this is now not a message that I'm like preaching to you. This is something I am trying to do on a daily basis, is to keep my focus on Jesus, to look to see what needs I can meet in the people that I come into contact with. And then once I've done that, then I can look at how can I have my own needs met. But most often, more often than not, by the time I've finished helping other people, my needs have actually been met already. And so may you discover the joy of serving Jesus. May you discover the joy of worshiping Jesus through serving others. May your needs be met as you worship Jesus, serve others, and enjoy life to the full. May God empower you to guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. Amen.